Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Associate Director of Public Programs and Events here at the IDA. Really excited for this conversation that we're about to have around the documentary Coded Bias. It's going to be moderated by LA Times' Lorraine Ali. Really excited for this. Before we get started, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you today from Los Angeles, which is on the unceded land of the Tongva and Chumash people, who have been stewards of this land for generations. I would also like to offer thanks to IndieWire for their support in bringing us the screening series this year, along with support from KCRW. So thank you to you both. And without any further ado, I'm going to bring on Lorraine here to begin our conversation. Welcome, Lorraine.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about Coded Bias. And I would like to introduce the director and producer of Coded Bias, Shalini Kantaya. And I would also like to introduce Dr. Sophia Noble, Associate Professor at UCLA, and also co-director of the Center of Critical Internet Inquiry. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
And I am excited to talk about Coded Bias because I have to say, I thought I knew about AI. I thought I knew not a lot, but enough, and knew something about how algorithms work. I know nothing after watching this. It's fascinating. So Shalini, I have to ask you to start with why pick this subject? It's unwieldy. It's a big, big subject, and you define it so well.
Oh, well, thank you for that. And thank you to IDA for hosting this screening and this conversation. I also didn't know what an algorithm was. 3 years ago, when I started this film, everything I knew about artificial intelligence had come through like the imagination of Steven Spielberg or Stanley Kubrick. I didn't know anything about AI. And I sort of well, I'm kind of a sci-fi fanatic, and I love tech, and a lot of my films explore disruptive technologies and if they make the world more fair or less fair. And I sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole reading a book called Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil, and discovered Joy Buolamwini's work and and then read an amazing book called Algorithms of Oppression by Dr. Sophia Umoja Noble, and Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, and so many others. And I realized that there was this whole canon of people who had been of journalists and researchers and scholars who've been really sounding the alarm of the sort of threats that AI could sort of cause to civil liberties and democracy. And I think when I first started making this film, I don't think I really realized the extent to which algorithms or machine learning or AI is already this sort of automated gatekeeper, sort of deciding such important things as who gets hired, who gets healthcare, who gets undue police scrutiny. And what I learned in the making of Coded Bias, which was like the most alarming, was not only are we outsourcing our decision making to machines, but these same systems haven't been vetted for racial bias or for gender bias, or for discrimination, or that they'll not do unintended harm. And so what I began to realize in the making of this film, much through the brilliant and badass research of Dr. Sophia Noble and others, that this is the civil rights issue of our time, that much of the progress that we've made over 50 years could be rolled back through these opaque black box systems. And so with the film, what I hope to do is kind of level the playing field, translate some of this incredible research into sort of bite-sized bits that people can digest, and make us realize that it's not just big tech that should be making these decisions, but that we all should empower ourselves with the knowledge so that we can all have a place at the table, and sort of a voice in how these systems are governed.
So, Dr. Noble, I want to ask you, um, clearly you're deeply researching this, but when you're talking to somebody outside of that realm, when you're talking to someone with my level of knowledge about this, how do you explain to them, just to start with, okay, you say artificial intelligence, automatically you do think Steven Spielberg, like, ridiculous film. I didn't like it very much. But anyway, the point being, how do you sort of explain to kind of the layman artificial intelligence and how it is influencing algorithms?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me today. I will say it was so interesting, Shalini, to hear you talk about the books that influenced you, because they were all written by women. And one of the things that I think is really important to highlight about that is that, you know, the kinds of people who are doing research in this area, we see things in in our own lives, in the lives of the communities that we come from, where, seemingly benign kinds of artificial intelligence are actually impacting our lives in very kind of subtle ways. So, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, let's just be clear, we're not talking about the sci fi Hollywood fantasies that come out of our backyard. We're talking about kind of narrow task driven kinds of automation. So we call this narrow AI. And, it might even be a little bit of a misnomer to call it intelligence, because I think what we're talking about are kind of mathematical formulas that do a lot of sorting and classifying people and things and ideas. And it's so, subtle. It's like an algorithm might decide whether your kids get into UCLA or not, in the sense that there are databases that might be looking at the profile of applicants and adjudicating them in terms of their GPA, their test scores, the kinds of high schools they went to, um, the number of activities that they've been involved in, whatever the kind of model is. There's some type of model always at the heart of a decision-making system like AI in this narrow sense. And everybody who's a deviation from that model is probably going to either fall out of being considered for something, or they are going to be too far outside of the consideration set. So this becomes really important when we see things like Amazon using AI to scan resumes and determine who should, they get thousands of resumes, right? And this was a big story a couple of years ago where they were using AI software screening to look at resumes. And it just so happened that the software screened out all of the women, 100% of the women. So you see, it's like, what is the model? And then who's the deviation from it? And these are the kinds of things that I think the kinds of scholars that Shalini was referencing, we're looking in the everyday, almost like mundane places and spaces, or the overlooked spaces where these kinds of technologies can have life or death consequences, or they can have a huge impact on opportunity, or excluding people from opportunity, or they can just simply distort and misrepresent people. And those are the kinds of things that I think that's the kind of AI that most people are interacting with every day.
So, Shalini, in the documentary, number one, I love that almost everybody, and perhaps everyone you talk to, it's all women, and it's largely women of color that you kind of relied on to kind of pull the narrative together. But what we're talking about is everything from, of course, you see whatever targeted shopping that you have online and that pops up, but then you're talking about who gets a loan, AI informing potentially a sentence for somebody, who's going to giving it to a judge to, inform a sentence for somebody. Will be a repeat offender, and then flipping it around and perhaps targeting people's weaknesses if somebody's a gambler, that kind of stuff. Like, it's so far reaching. And then and we haven't even started talking about facial recognition yet. So Shalini, when you're looking at how to pull this together, how did you? Because AI touches every single aspect of our life. How did you pull this film together?
It was very challenging. I always say, like, I couldn't talk to people for the 2 years I was making it because I was trying to digest all of this information, and I couldn't yet articulate what the story is. So people would ask me what I was making a film about, and I'd sort of scratch my head. I'd be like, I'm making a film about racist robots. Because it was so hard to understand for someone who has no background. I don't have advanced degrees in any of this, in to try to tell a story. But I think for me, it would have been much easier to tell a story about facial recognition. But honestly, I followed my own curiosity, and I think that I, I think that what the audience goes through with Coded Bias is my own discovery of this field and just how far down the rabbit hole it does. And what you're saying, the realization that you had watching it, I had making it. Like, oh my God, they're using it for prison sentencing. What? It's already deciding this hiring. Wait, it weeds out all women. Wait, what? Like, I literally, I couldn't actually believe all the uses of it, and the way that we put faith in it, especially as people who don't have degrees in it. We're sort of taught to trust these machines with impunity. Even someone with a PhD, if they say something and like a computer says something, well, obviously the computer is always right. And I think it took through this brave body of mostly women's research that really informed me, because they helped translate this world to me, and I sort of pull upon the language of science fiction to this like sort of visual language, because it's sort of what our common language about AI, to help us understand what AI really is and what it isn't.
Right. And one of the points that's brought up in the film is that even, I hope I get this right, but even the people who are programming this or creating it, they're not even entirely sure how it's working. They know what the end game is and what they want to get to, but they're not even sure entirely in the middle how it's working. And, all this information that is in there, it's self-learning, right? This machine is learning. So they're not entirely sure. It's almost like a black box in there from the start to the from the start to the finish, right? So, Dr. Noble, how problematic is that, I guess, because it seems like, the main studies going into this are from technology giants, and they're ostensibly the corporations that are going to profit from AI and from these algorithms. So what's missing here?
Yeah, it's really true that one of the biggest challenges is that the narratives about what these projects are is mostly narrated by big tech companies. So they're kind of setting the terms of belief and engagement. For example, that the more data they have, the better decisions that can be made, right? That there's something inherently more reliable or trustworthy about pattern recognition in a lot of data, rather than what human beings might see, right, as a system. Now, this is interesting. As a scholar, I understand intimately, I'm an information scientist, and I understand intimately that we make data also. We socially construct data. Data isn't just delivered down from heaven. It is a process of human categorization. Statistics are also kind of a human invention, right? So data is made by humans, it's collected upon humans, it's organized, it is lines of demarcation and classification are also made by humans. But when you start to get into very, very large data sets, you start to do a couple of things. One, some of this categorization is like an abstraction of a human experience versus the very granular texture of a human experience, right? So this is important because a lot of things fall out the more data you have, right? You have more and more abstraction. So this becomes a very big issue. And of course, this is probably one of the greatest tensions between thinking about how important, let's say, a novel is for helping us understand the human condition versus a giant data set. Okay, so there, you've learned different things about human beings with kind of different ways of knowing. And I think one of the things that's been a challenge is that we're living in a time where anything that isn't kind of a big data abstraction is kind of not considered legitimate, right, or not important. So this is a narrative that justifies massive data collection, for example, that people think we need to collect data on people, store it infinitely, and refer back to it over the course of a person's lifetime. And one of the things we also know about collecting data, let's say all three of us know what it was like, the day we reported the data on getting our driver's license, let's say. Okay, so there's like self-reported data that is also reflecting a moment in time that maybe doesn't hold up 10 years later. So many different, right, complexities about what is data, what does it mean, and for whom, and at what point in time. But there's very little space to interrogate that. And so this is one of the things that I think we're so concerned with studying at UCLA, for example, in our center, which is how does the kind of making the narratives about data and its use and its kind of the way it gets implemented really harm people? How does it undermine our humanity, right? How does it render us more vulnerable? What can we do to speak back? Do we even have a say? Can we say, hold on, we don't want this? And I think what Shalini's film has done so beautifully by taking the example of facial recognition, and of course, looking to see how facial recognition technology, for example, has been beta tested on the most vulnerable, right? Black women living in housing projects. This is where the experiment of its efficacy happens, because it gets experimented on the most vulnerable people on our society before it's normalized and rolled out on the rest of us. And I think there's a tremendous amount at stake when we think about what it means to kind of embrace this paradigm. And of course, part of the challenge is these kinds of practices make it very difficult for us to see when civil rights and human rights are being violated, to push back. As Shalini referenced our friend and colleague, Cathy O'Neil, in her amazing book, Weapons of Math Destruction. One of the things she says in that book is, you can't sue an algorithm, right? It's real hard to take an algorithm to court. So this is the kind of work that we all do, is we say, well, listen, where are the points that we can even say, this data about me does not fairly represent me, and it also should not over determine my future. It should not predict me in or out of opportunity in the future, because who I am today or who I was 10 years ago when you got that data is not who I'll be 10 years from now. And I think these are the kinds of really serious kind of consequences we need to be thinking about with this narrative of more data and more predictive technology is better. I don't think the evidence bears out the truth of that yet.
So Shalini, there's so many questions I want to ask here, but so you have several examples, inside of this film of places where AI and these algorithms have done the very thing that we're talking about here. Either they've, for class, race, gender, they've somehow, their magic formulas where we're not even sure how they're working inside have wreaked havoc in people's lives. Can you talk a little bit about some of those particulars, like whether it's the teacher, I think it's in Houston, or, because I thought
Yeah,
those.
absolutely. Because it's one of the things that I'm actually proud of, because I feel that I was reading one of Eli Pariser's tweets, and it says, like, he said, I've been to a lot of conferences about the future of technology, but none about the future of humanity. And I feel like we always talk about technology like there are no humans involved in it. And I think one of the things I'm proudest of the film is that it really not just tries to communicate some of the science and make it accessible, but also connects it to people who as Kathy O'Neill says in her book, for whom the system could fail. So one of those stories is like what you said, a Houston teacher, Daniel Santos, who, if you were around him for 10 minutes, you would know he was a good teacher. He's just that committed and dedicated and passionate about his students. And yet an algorithm through this value added model, which is still being used in some places to randomly evaluate teachers, was evaluated as a bad teacher. And you could see just like the disgrace. It wasn't just a matter, you could tell that it was his honor and his dignity and his reputation that he felt personally attacked, because he had so much pride in being a good teacher. And so it just, he actually was able to, the teachers union, he joined with the teachers union, and the teachers union fought this value added model and won, because it was a black box, and that he was deserving of due process. If you fire someone, you should let them know by what criteria you're firing them. And so it goes to show how these black box systems can be used in ways that don't make sense, or given this undue authority. And I would never know how to question them until I read all of these books, right? And until I started sitting with the thought leaders in my film. And yet courageous people like Trenae Moran, she didn't even know what biometric data was when her landlord tried to put facial recognition in her housing complex, somewhere that she'd lived for 3 generations. And basically now, not only do you need like a key fob and there's a gatekeeper, but now you want to get your face scanned, and it's going to a third party company who's doing it for free, because you don't know what they're doing with that data. The landlord owns, by the way, apartment buildings in Manhattan and rich neighborhoods, but that's not where he's implemented facial recognition. It starts in these places that you assume are not going to fight back for their rights. But they got organized, and they got a legal team, and they not only stopped their landlord from installing facial recognition, but they inspired some of the first legislation that would protect other housing residents from having that kind of invasive surveillance. So it's still really hard for everyday people to fight back. But I find where the opportunity is I think everyday people are learning about this research and empowering themselves and saying, we don't have to accept this. We can actually question the system. It's not infallible. It can be wrong. And we don't have to be subject to this kind of invasive surveillance. So I think like everyday people having access to information in the stories in Coded Bias, I hope will help.
Yeah, and I think that's what it does so well. It does really, you're right. It's like attaching it to what is the human toll here? Mm-hmm. What is, how is this essential? What's the fallout on humans? And it was almost as if using these women as experiment subjects, and I thought there was a really good point made that, when people would talk about like AI, whatever, 20 years ago, like it's a futuristic thing and it's going to be, the rich and powerful, and they're all going to have, it's like, no, they're using that to, in the projects essentially. So, I mean, I just thought that was really interesting, like flipping that around. It's like, okay, we're going to use you as almost experiment subjects.
Absolutely. Virginia Eubank's work, I mean, really began to see where these invasive surveillance, the communities in which who are most impacted by these predatory technologies.
And how, I kind of throw this out to both of you. So because there is bias, whether we're talking about, class, race, gender in society, and humans are feeding this information in, but also, this machines are learning off this, it's perpetuating these bias that's already there. So how can this be unlearned? Like, how can this be sort of, I know I'm asking like this giant question, please solve it right here for me. But like, how do you untangle this?
I mean, it's a fair question. The truth is that many of the largest tech firms who are using and making different types of AI aren't even sure, to your earlier point, how some of those technologies work. So, in the case of something that I've studied very closely in the past, like search engines and Google, we're talking about, uh, a search lab that takes into account, by Google's own reporting, over 200 different factors. We're talking about engineers that have worked more than 20 years now on that technology. It's not like you can just, like in the old days, just lift up the hood and change the oil, right, or replace the carburetor. We're talking about very complex algorithms that people do not necessarily even know, working in these companies, how to fix. In fact, one of the things that we study is the way in which they don't fix. And not only do they not fix, but they don't use AI. They use human beings to go in and moderate and make decisions. So we know that there's actually a fantasy, even, that some of these things are fully automated. There's still this kind of imperative around whether it's content moderators, which my colleague at UCLA studies so closely, Sarah Roberts, people who are going in and adjudicating, and must, because they have to, these technologies have to comply with the law, and there's a lot of illegal things that happen on the internet, as we all know. So, I think part of what this work is about doing is, one, making it very visible just how, let's say, oversold some of these technologies are in terms of their efficiency and their reliability, and that they can just be tweaked and made less racist or less sexist, right? Instead, I think the kinds of questions we need to be asking is, why do we need some of these projects? What is it that is to be gained when we have mounting evidence that to use some of these technologies, in fact, exacerbates and makes more difficult our ability to apprehend discrimination in society and remedy it? So I think these are really important questions that are being asked. I mean, who voted and said we wanted facial recognition rolled out on us? Where is our agency as a public to be able to say we don't want it? Now, it's very interesting because when you look at these kinds of surveillance technologies, when Google's cameras, right, their cars with cameras for their mapping service, go into wealthy communities around the world, you really see this in the UK, where those cars get flipped over by the residents who live there, who refuse to have their homes and their children caught up into these projects. So again, the kind of class disparity, the way in which these technologies, again, get deployed and tried out and exercised on working people, on poor people, it's really so that they can be perfected before they're pointed at upper middle class and elite folks in our society. So no one's actually uh, uh, going to not be ensnared. I think the kinds of things that sociologists and that we do around this work is we say, well, why is it that the elite tech workers, CEOs, executives in Silicon Valley and Silicon Beach have agreements with their nannies that their children cannot be have pictures taken of them and uploaded to these systems. Why is it that they have a different set of rules? Well, it's because many of them, those workers, have disclosed that they're indeed frightened about the implications of their children being caught up in these kinds of surveillance technologies that are gamified and made fun. And, I think we have to ask ourselves a lot of very tough questions. This, of course, is where um, the very current and contemporary conversations about regulation, about consumer harm, about civil rights and data are really finally moving to the forefront of the broader kind of political conversations. But again, I would say it's because of the work that women and LGBTQ and scholars and journalists of color and filmmakers like Shalini are doing to destabilize this idea that these technologies are just like a Spielberg movie. In fact, they are deepening social, racial, and economic inequality in the world. And we have to pay close attention to this because it's very difficult to intervene upon these systems.
Shalini, what kind of kickback, or what kind of not kickback is not the right word, blowback? I mean, have you gotten opposition to in making this film? Have you gotten, because you are disrupting something that people don't, well, a very small handful of people don't want disrupted?
Well, I will say I've been actually surprised how the warm response I've gotten. Um, and I would say all of the major tech companies have posted screenings of the film, and some it could be their ethical AI department or some small subsection of these companies. But that makes me incredibly excited because I mean I had the benefit of having a Sundance premiere where I got to see the film with the unimaginable right now, which is I got to see the film with the audience. And someone who works at Google came up to me and said, we know this is happening, and we've been having this conversation within ourselves, with internally, and you made a conversation that we can all have together. And I thought that was, at least some conversation is starting to happen. And I do think that I mean, maybe Dr. Noble will disagree with me, but I do think there are many well-meaning people who work at these companies who know these issues exist. It's just a question of, I don't believe that the companies should be the only ones left to solve them. But I would say so far for the film, they've been receptive to the film. The companies have been receptive to the film.
Yeah, I want to, echo that. I think we're starting to see a number of tech workers in big tech companies who are profoundly committed to ensuring that their labor and their time and their skills and their genius is not used in service of harm to the public, and especially to vulnerable workers and vulnerable people and communities. So whether that's Google workers organizing and walking out and saying they're not going to work on drone technology, for example, that where drones are killing brown people halfway around the world, and they don't understand how their work is getting used in service of that, and they're not going to work on Department of Defense contracts and weapons. The challenge here is that, when you think about a company like Google, who's just been in the headlines, including today, around firing their most prominent AI ethicists. And of course, I'm talking about Dr. Timnit Gebru, who is the collaborator with Joy Buolamwini, who is the main character of this film, who was a part of this very important gender shades study. She's a co-author on the gender shades study that helped us understand that facial recognition doesn't see Black women's faces, for example, or is incredibly racially discriminatory. She was the chief, one of the top AI ethicists at Google, and was, basically canned a few weeks ago for pointing out to the leadership of Google that its natural language processing AI was discriminatory, had serious problems with racial and gender discrimination, and she was fired. And now her whole team is vulnerable to being fired too, as we speak. So what we see is actually where, again, it's not lost on me that she is also a Black woman. When Black women, women of color, again, LGBTQ women who are some of the most prominent AI ethicists in this country, working in these companies, when they do their job of actually seeing and recognizing the harm, they get fired because the limits of their influence really pushing up against the business models and the profit imperative for these companies gets put on display when they do that work. So I think we have to remember that there are good people trying to do work in these companies. Those people are incredibly vulnerable. Dr. Jabrou's firing actually became a catalyst for Alphabet, which is the parent company that owns Google, to their workers unionizing here in the last couple of weeks. So there's some really interesting things happening around how workers are also saying, even white collar workers saying, hey, the kinds of things that these companies are doing, Amazon, Google, Apple, Microsoft, the big companies, it's not okay. It's harmful. And we need to have a way to push back. And I think that gives me a lot of energy. And this is one of the reasons why I love this film, because I feel like it energizes these conversations and it helps us explain and storytell to the public what's at stake. Whether it's, the essential worker who's dropping off a package right now in COVID-19 in these times in the United States, these workers all over the country who are so incredibly vulnerable, barely living on in complete precarity without enough wages, while everyone at the top is becoming trillionaires. I mean, these are the kinds of questions that I think, to your earlier point, when we talk about we are the source of profit. This is really important. I mean, how could anybody want to talk about anything but this right now? Of course, you see how passionate I am about it because it's so, so important.
Well, thank you both so much for talking about this. I cannot recommend enough to watch Coded Bias. It is excellent. It really opened my eyes. I want to know more. I want to know more. I want to know more now. So thank you both so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much.